My son told me I was suffocating him, and my first instinct, my very first immediate gut-level instinct, was to explain to him why he was wrong. That's where this story begins. Not with what he said, with what I did next, because what I did next almost ended us. And I came so close to not seeing it that it still frightens me when I let myself think about it too long. I'm going to tell you everything. The parts that make me look good and the much longer parts that don't. Because I've spent the last 2 years trying to understand how a person can love someone completely, genuinely, absolutely, with everything they have, and still be the thing that hurts them. I think I finally understand it now, and I needed to say it out loud. My name is Marin. I live in Summerfield, a mid-sized city that people from bigger places have never heard of, which suits me fine. I've lived here my whole life. Same neighborhood I grew up in, same grocery store. I took my son Theo home from the hospital to a house 3 streets over from the one I was born in, and there was something I always found deeply comforting about that. Continuity, roots. The quiet certainty that if something happened to me, the streets would still be there for him. That part of me would be there, even after I wasn't. Theo was born on a Thursday in November. 31 hours of labor. I won't give you the details, you're welcome. But I'll tell you this, by the time they put him in my arms, I had been awake for 2 full days. And I felt the most alert I had ever been in my life. Like every cell in my body had reorganized itself to point toward this one small person. He had very serious eyes. That was the first thing I noticed. Not small or squinting the way newborns sometimes are, just watchful. Like he was already taking inventory. His father, Garrett, and I separated when Theo was 4. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quieter, sadder kind of separation, the kind where 2 people realize they became roommates somewhere along the way and neither of them can remember exactly when. We have always put Theo first. I want to be clear about that. Garrett is a good man and a good father, and he will appear in this story. And when he does, he will be one of the few people who comes out looking entirely decent. Theo lived primarily with me after the separation, weekends and school breaks with Garrett. It was our arrangement worked out carefully, with very little drama, or so I told myself. I'm not someone who needs to be the center of things. I've never wanted to be the loudest person in any room. I just wanted, and this is so simple it almost sounds made up, I just wanted my son to know that whatever he needed, I was there. Always. Whatever happened, whatever time, whatever crisis or joy or ordinary confused Tuesday, I would be there. That was my whole project, my whole purpose, if I'm honest. I left the hallway light on whenever Theo was out at night. Every single time. From the time he was 12 until the time he was 17. When things finally broke open, that light was on. So he'd know someone was waiting. So he'd never come home to darkness. I'm telling you that because it will matter later. I should also tell you, and this is the part I always kind of glossed over when I told this story to myself, that my own mother, Constance, used to call me 3 times a day until I was 31 years old. Every day. Morning, midday, evening. Like a check-in system, I moved to the opposite end of Summerfield when I was 25, and the calls didn't stop. I remember laughing about it with friends. That's just how she is, I'd say. She worries. I thought that was just love. I genuinely thought that was what love looked like. More on that later. Theo was 16 when I first noticed something had changed. Not 16 when it broke. I want to be precise about that. Because the breaking and the beginning of the breaking are 2 different things. And the distance between them is where all the real damage happened. He'd always been a talker. Not loud, not the kind of kid who dominated a dinner table, but a sharer. He told me about his days. He'd come home from school and wander into whatever room I was in and just start talking. He told me about arguments with friends, teachers who'd said something funny, songs he'd heard. That was our rhythm. That was how we worked. And then, sometime in the spring of his sophomore year, he stopped. It happened gradually, which is why I almost didn't notice. Or, the more honest version, it's why I told myself I hadn't noticed. Looking back, I think I noticed almost immediately. I just didn't want to know what it meant. He started going directly to his room after school. I'd hear the door, then quiet. I'd knock, and he'd say, "I'm fine, just tired," and I'd believe him. Or I'd act like I believed him, which felt like the same thing at the time. By October, we were having maybe 20 minutes of real conversation a day, most of it logistics. What's for dinner? Can you sign this form? What time is practice? The kind of talking that keeps a household running but tells you nothing about the person inside it. I started doing things I'm not proud of. Small things at first. I'd find reasons to go upstairs when he was up there. I'd remember something completely inconsequential I'd meant to tell him, just to open the door. I rearranged the linen closet outside his room twice in 1 month. I asked more careful questions at dinner, more specific ones, trying to find the thread that would pull him back into talking. He answered, politely, briefly, and went back to his food. I told Garrett about it in November. We talked on the phone most Sundays, the three of us together, and then Theo would go upstairs and Garrett and I would sometimes talk for another few minutes. I told him Theo seemed distant. Garrett said, "He's 16, Marin." I said, "No, it's different." He said, "What specifically is different?" And I didn't have a good answer, which annoyed me more than the question. Then came the conversation, the one I've replayed probably 500 times. It was a Sunday, January. One of those January days in Summerfield where the light is flat and gray from the moment it arrives until it gives up and leaves again. Theo had been in his room since noon. I made dinner, his favorite pasta with the roasted tomato sauce he'd requested since he was 9, and I called him down. He came, he sat, he ate about half of it. And I asked, I thought I was being gentle, I thought I was being careful. I asked if everything was okay because I felt like he'd been pulling away and I just wanted him to know I was there. He put his fork down, he looked at me, and he said, "Mom, I need you to stop." I said, "Stop what?" He said, "Just everything. I feel like I can't breathe. I feel like you're always right there. Like there's no room." I remember the specific sensation of those words. Not hearing them, something more physical than hearing, like a pressure change in the room. I said, "I'm your mother. I'm supposed to be there." He said, "I know. But there's a difference between being there and I feel like I'm watched all the time. I feel like everything I do gets examined. I feel like I can't be in a bad mood without you treating it like a crisis. I can't have a hard day without you needing to fix it. I can't just be. I feel like you need me to be okay more than you need me to actually be okay." He said that last part slowly, like he'd thought about it, like he'd practiced it enough to finally say it. And I sat there, looking at this person I had loved with every cell I possessed for 16 years, and something in me went very cold and very defensive and very quiet. And I said, "I think that's unfair." He nodded, like he'd expected that exact answer. "I know you do," he said, and he picked his fork back up, and we finished dinner without speaking. I washed the dishes and I cried quietly into the sink, and I was absolutely, completely convinced that I was the wronged party. That conviction is what this story is really about. I want to walk you through the 3 weeks after that dinner, because they are the most uncomfortable part of this story to tell, and also the most necessary. I did not, in those 3 weeks a week, do a single useful thing. I did many, many things. None of them were useful. Most of them made it worse. The first thing I did was compile evidence. I'm serious. I sat at my kitchen table the following Monday with a notebook. I still have it. I found it last year. And I made a list of everything I had done for Theo in the previous year. Every school event I attended, every meal I cooked, every time I'd driven him somewhere, waited for him somewhere, stayed up to make sure he got home safely, the field trips, the sick days, the late night talks when he'd had nightmares at 14, and I'd sat on the edge of his bed for an hour without saying a word. I wrote it all down, this long, detailed inventory of my love, and when I was done, I felt something I can only describe as grim satisfaction, like I had built a case. Like there was a trial coming and I was going to win. I showed the list to my sister Bet on Wednesday. We met for coffee, the way we did every other week. I brought the notebook. I read her sections of it. I watched her face. Bet has a face that is very difficult to read, which has always slightly annoyed me. But I thought I saw something like sympathy there. She nodded a lot. She said, "I hear you. I hear you is not the same as you're right." I didn't register that at the time. What Bet actually said as we were putting our coats on to leave was, "Marin, have you considered that maybe both things can be true?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "That you love him completely and that it's also been a lot for him. Both things being true at the same time." I said I didn't really follow. She nodded, slowly, carefully, the way people nod when they've decided not to push. "Okay," she said. And we hugged in the parking lot and drove in separate directions. I told myself Bet didn't fully understand the situation. The following Sunday, I decided that what Theo needed was to see, concretely, that I was not the problem he thought I was, that I could be light, easy, low pressure. I was going to prove it. So I made his favorite breakfast. I left it outside his room on a tray with a little note, "No pressure, just leaving this here." I fully realize now that no pressure delivered on a tray is still a tray. He came downstairs later and thanked me politely, and I watched him for signs of thawing, and he could tell I was watching, and by 11 in the morning he was back in his room. I texted him, "I just want you to know I'm not upset about what you said," he replied. "Okay, one letter, lowercase. No period." I called my friend Nola that night. Nola is the kind of friend who tells you things you don't want to hear, but wraps them in such genuine affection that it's hard to be angry. She listened to all of it, the dinner conversation, the list, the breakfast tray, the okay text, without interrupting. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "When was the last time you let Theo be upset about something and just left it? He was upset and you didn't try to fix it or make it better or check on it. You just let him carry something." I thought about it, genuinely thought about it. I couldn't come up with a clear example. Nola said gently, "I think maybe Theo's been tasting something for longer than that one dinner, and I think you might want to hear it." I said I needed to go. Something on the stove. I didn't have anything on the stove. I sat in my kitchen for nights, not doing anything, just sitting, and the feeling wasn't enlightenment or the beginning of understanding. The feeling was quiet, building, very controlled anger at Nola, at Bet, at Garrett's patient, he's 16, from November, at all of them who seemed to be, in my interpretation, taking my son's side against me when I had done nothing but love him. That's when I started writing the document. I call it the document because I'm not sure what else to call it. I opened a blank Word file on my laptop, late January, a Thursday, maybe 10 at night, and I started writing. Not a journal entry. Not venting. It was structured. It was an argument. It was effectively a rebuttal of everything Theo had said to me at dinner. I organized it into sections. I addressed each of his specific points. I cited examples, the way lawyers cite precedent, of instances where my behavior had been reasonable, necessary, even beneficial. I wrote about the cultural expectation that children feel some resentment toward devoted parents, and how that is developmentally normal and not proof of wrongdoing. I wrote about how much harder single parent makes everything, how much more you have to compensate, how the involvement I'd shown was not control, but coverage. I wrote it over 3 evenings. I proofread it. I made it better. On the 3rd evening, I printed it. I held the pages and read the whole thing one more time, all 8 pages, and somewhere around page 5, I felt something shift. Not a big shift, just a small, quiet wrongness, like a single note that's slightly off-key in a song you know by heart. I put the pages in a drawer. I didn't throw them away. I still don't know why. Maybe because destroying the argument felt like losing it. In February, things got measurably worse. Theo started eating dinner in his room. Not every night at first, 2 or 3 nights a week, with specific reasons that seemed plausible. Then 4 nights, then for 1 full week in mid-February, all 5 weekdays. I'm going to tell you what I did next, and I want you to understand that I knew, even as I was doing it, that it wasn't the right move. I knew. I did it anyway. I knocked on his door that Wednesday. He said, "Come in." I sat on the edge of his desk chair and I said, "I don't think it's healthy for us not to eat together." He looked up from his laptop. He said, "Mom," just that, just my name. But the way he said it, like it contained an entire exhausted conversation that he was too tired to have. I said, "I'm serious. Family dinner matters. Connection matters. I'm not going to accept that we're strangers living in the same house." He said, "That's not what I said I wanted." I said, "Then what do you want?" "Because I'm trying here and I don't know what to do." He said something I wasn't ready for. He said, "I want you to want something for yourself. Something that isn't me." I stared at him. "I feel like your whole life is just me," he said. "And it's too much. It's too much pressure. I don't want to be your whole reason. That's not fair to put on me. I'm 17. I stood up. I said, "I think you're being cruel." He flinched. A small, almost invisible flinch. I left the room. I walked downstairs and sat on the couch and put on the television and watched it without seeing it for an hour. And at some point, I realized I was waiting for my 17-year-old to come downstairs and apologize. That's what I was doing, sitting there in the blue light of the television, waiting for him to undo what he had said and make me feel better. He didn't come downstairs. That night, I lay awake, and for the first time the thought came, not loud, barely a whisper, that maybe Bet had been right. that maybe both things could be true at the same time. I batted it away, but it came back, smaller and quieter each time, and a little harder to dismiss. The phone call that changed everything happened because I called my mother to complain. That's the honest way to say it. I called Constance on a Sunday afternoon in late February. Theo was at Garrett's for the weekend, and I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and told her about the dinners, about the document, about the conversations, about Theo's face when I'd told him he was being cruel. I told her all of it. Her to say what I'd wanted everyone to say. That I was a good mother, that my son didn't know yet what he had, that he'd understand someday. Constance listened. She's a good listener, actually. Not warm exactly, but attentive. You feel heard, even when you're not being truly understood. She said, "Well, you've always given that boy everything, yes. You've sacrificed for him. You've been there every step. Some children don't appreciate it until much later." And I agreed, and she kept talking, and I kept agreeing. And somewhere around 15 minutes in, something started happening that I couldn't name at first. A kind of low-level static, like interference on a signal. She was talking about my cousin's daughter. Apparently, the girl had said something ungrateful to her own mother at Thanksgiving. And Constance was cataloging everything my cousin had done for that girl, year by year, sacrifice by sacrifice. I was listening and nodding, and then I wasn't nodding because I was hearing, in my mother's voice, something I had heard before. The same cadence, the same architecture of the argument, the same inventory of love as evidence, the same absolute, impenetrable certainty that love, by virtue of its quantity and sincerity, could not possibly be the cause of harm. I was hearing myself, from the outside, in my mother's voice. I sat very still. Constance said, "Marin, are you there?" I said, "I'm here. Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." I said, when I was growing up, did I ever tell you I felt like I didn't have enough space?" A pause. "You were a sensitive child," she said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer this time. "You sometimes wanted more privacy than was reasonable," she said carefully. "But I was your mother. I was doing my job," I said. "Did it ever occur to you that calling me 3 times a day might have been about you, about what you needed? Not about what I needed." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence I'm not sure I experienced before or since. It wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive, though I'd expected defensive. It was quieter than that. Something almost cornered. She said, "I just never wanted you to need anyone more than you needed me." Very quietly, like it came out before she could decide whether she wanted to say it. I didn't have a response ready for that, because it wasn't a defense or a dismissal. It was just a true thing, said by someone who hadn't fully realized it was true until she heard herself say it. I said, "I know, Mom." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing. We said goodbye. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. I went upstairs. I found the drawer. I took out the 8-page document and read it again, all the way through. It read differently now. Every argument I'd made for myself, every piece of evidence I'd marshaled, every reasonable justification, it all still technically held. Nothing I'd written was factually wrong. But the whole thing had a quality I'd missed before. The quality of someone who needed very badly to not be the problem, not who wanted to understand the problem, who needed to be excluded from it. I thought about the way Constance had cataloged my cousin's sacrifices, and I recognized every move of that conversation because I had made every one of those moves myself in the past month. The evidence gathering, the reasonableness, the patient, building, well-organized grief of a person who cannot conceive that their love might have a shape that hurts. I thought about Theo at 7 drawing our family portrait, me with very large hands. I thought about the hallway light. I thought about 3 phone calls a day until I was 31. I thought about the fact that I had never once, in Theo's entire childhood, let him carry something without trying to lift it from him. That every difficult feeling he had, sadness, disappointment, frustration, the ordinary bruises of growing up, I had rushed toward it. I had smoothed it and solved it, and been so present in the middle of it that there was no room for him to find out whether he could handle it himself. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Those would have been, in some ways, easier. I just sat very quietly with 8 pages of an argument I had prepared to defend myself. And I understood something I did not want to understand about the difference between being there for someone and being in someone's way. It's not a comfortable feeling. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't a relief. It wasn't a breakthrough with swelling music behind it. It was more like pressing on a bruise and finding out it's deeper than you thought. There's a kind of grief in it. I think I had half known something was off balance for years, and keeping myself busy with all that love had been a very effective way of not looking directly at it. I folded the document, slowly, carefully. I didn't throw it away. Part of me wasn't ready to stop holding the argument. I didn't do anything dramatic. I want to say that clearly, because I think we expect transformation to look dramatic. The scenes where the parent falls to their knees, or writes the perfect letter, or makes the grand gesture that repairs everything in one evening. That isn't what happened. What happened was smaller than that, and slower, and significantly more uncomfortable, and it took months. The first thing I did was make an appointment with a therapist. Her name is Dr. Enright, and she said a number of things I didn't want to hear and will be sharing here. The second thing I did was call Nola back and say, I think I hung up on you last month. Nola said, you didn't hang up. You just left. I said, I owed you an apology. She said, you owe Theo an apology. I know. I said, I'm working on it. Good, she said, with warmth, not triumph. That's Nola. The third thing I did was not knock on Theo's door for 11 days. 11 days. I counted. It was the hardest thing I had done in years. Harder than the separation, harder than the early single-parent months, harder than any of the logistical difficulties of raising a child alone. Because in all those other hard things, I could do something, I could act, I could fix. This required the opposite of everything I knew how to do. I cooked dinners. I texted him when there was a concrete thing to communicate. I did not arrange reasons to pass his door. I did not engineer encounters. I let the silence be silence. On the fourth day, I cried in the shower for about 15 minutes because I was terrified he was building a life that didn't have me in it, and I didn't know how to stop being afraid of that. On the seventh day, Dr. Enright asked me, what do you think will happen if Theo needs you less? I said, he's my son. He's supposed to need me. She said, for how long? I started to answer and realized I didn't have an end date in my head. Somewhere in my image of our relationship, he was always going to need me at roughly the same level. Forever, I had never constructed an image of him not needing me. Because that image, him capable, self-sufficient, not looking toward me for the next thing, felt less like success and more like loss, like obsolescence. Dr. Enright said, what does that tell you about what you're actually afraid of? I told her I needed a minute. On the 11th day, Theo came downstairs. He didn't have a reason, no form to sign, no logistical question. He just came into the kitchen where I was reading and said, is there any of that pasta left? I said, there's some from Tuesday. I don't know if it's still good. Looked in the fridge and said, it's fine, and heated it up and sat at the table with his phone, and I read my book. And neither of us filled the silence with anything. After 20 minutes, he said, thanks for dinner, and went back upstairs. That was it. That was the whole thing. And I sat there after he left and felt something I want to describe carefully, because it mattered. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even warmth exactly. It was just space. Space that was his, that I hadn't colonized with my attention, and in that space, something small and real had happened. A mundane moment, Tuesday pasta, and it had belonged entirely to him. I understood then what Dr. Enright had been pointing me toward. I'd been treating Theo's life like a room in my house. I'd wallpapered it and organized it and made it comfortable and kept the light on and thought all of that was love. But it was his room. It had always been his room. And all the wallpapering in the world is still you putting your hands on something that belongs to someone else. I need to tell you about one more conversation with Constance. About 6 weeks after the phone call, when I had been seeing Dr. Enright regularly and had begun to understand things I didn't know how to understand before, I drove to her house, 20 minutes from me, still in Summerfield, the same house I grew up in, and sat with her in her kitchen. It smells the same as it did when I was small. Coffee and that particular soap she has bought in the same brand for my entire life. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't carrying a document. I just said, Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. About needing me to need you more than anyone. She looked at her coffee cup. I said, I think I did the same thing to Theo. She was quiet. Then, without looking up, she said, your grandmother was very hard on me, very critical. Nothing I did was ever right. She paused. I wanted to be the opposite of that. I wanted you to always feel like I was on your side. Like you could come to me. I know, I said. I didn't think about whether I was making space for you not to come to me, she said. Whether not coming to me should also be allowed. She said it looking at her coffee cup quietly, and I don't think she had ever said it before. I don't think she had ever thought it quite so directly before. It wasn't a confession that transformed her. She's still Constance. She still calls me, just less than 3 times a day because I asked gently. More than once, and she's made an imperfect effort. She isn't changed. She's just someone who said one true thing in a kitchen and looked, briefly, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I reached over and covered her hand with mine. She said, I just never wanted to be your grandmother. I said, I know, Mom, you weren't. We sat there for a while without needing to fill it. He wrote me a letter. I want to be very clear. I did not ask for a letter. I did not create the conditions for one. It came from nowhere, which is why it landed the way it did. It was a Friday in April. I came home from work and there was an envelope on the kitchen table, propped against the fruit bowl. My name on the outside, Marin. His handwriting, very neat, very deliberate, the kind that belongs to someone saying to someone who thinks carefully before committing anything to a surface. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes before opening it. I want to tell you I opened it calmly. That isn't true. My hands weren't steady. My reading wasn't smooth. I got through the first paragraph and had to put it down and stand at the sink for a moment, not because it was cruel. It wasn't cruel, but because it was specific in a way I hadn't been prepared for. He wrote, Mom, I don't think you're a bad person or a bad mother. I need you to know that first because I know how this might sound. But I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 2 years, and I think if I don't write it down, it just won't come out right. 2 years. He had been carrying this for 2 years before he set his fork down in January. And in the time between his first trying to say it and his finally saying it, I had been so focused on recovering the closeness we'd had that I missed the fact that he was preparing for a different kind of closeness. A grown one. One that required more distance, not less. He wrote, I know you leave the light on for me. I've always known. And I know it's because you love me and you want me to know you're there. But Mom, I've been home for 3 years without needing a light to know you're there. You're always there. And I think maybe leaving the light on is for you, not me. I read that 3 times. He wrote, I've been in therapy. I haven't told you because I thought you'd feel guilty or like you'd done something wrong. And I didn't want to manage your feelings about it on top of everything else. He'd been in therapy. Garrett knew they'd arranged it together when Theo quietly asked if there was someone he could talk to. Garrett hadn't told me because Theo had asked him not to, and Garrett respected that, and I don't think Garrett is entirely without fault for keeping it from me. I also think with effort, with the particular effort Dr. Enright has been building in me, I also think that Theo was allowed to have things I didn't know about. He was allowed to have things I didn't know about. He wrote, My therapist asked me what I would need from you for things to be different, and I said I'd need you to want things for yourself, not just for me. I'd need you to have a life that was yours, not just mine. Because when your whole life is organized around me, then everything I do either feeds that or threatens it, and that's too much. That's not my job. I'm 17. He was right. He was so plainly, simply, undramatically right. He wrote, I love you. I want you in my life. I want to talk to you about things. I want to eat dinner with you. I just need you to be a person, not just my mom. Does that make sense? It made sense. He signed it. Theo. Not love Theo, just Theo. Which somehow landed harder than any declaration would have. I folded the letter. I put it in my pocket. I walked upstairs. I knocked on his door. He said, Come in. He was sitting at his desk, headphones around his neck. He looked at me with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not guarded, not hostile, but careful. Like someone who has thrown a stone into water and is watching to see what kind of surface it was. I said, I read your letter. He nodded. I said, You were right? Most of it, maybe all of it. Definitely more of it than I've been willing to admit. He didn't speak. He was watching me. I said, I have not handled the last year well. I went to a therapist. I'm trying to understand some things about myself they're taking some time. And I'm not going to tell you it's fixed because it isn't. But I wanted you to know that I heard you. That I'm not writing a document in my head right now about why you're wrong. Something shifted in his face. A very small thing, a small involuntary relaxation. I said, I want to apologize for telling you that you were being cruel. That was me protecting myself. You weren't being cruel. You were being honest, and I wasn't ready to hear it, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Thank you. I said, I'm going to keep making mistakes. I want to warn you about that up front so it's not a surprise. But I'm trying to make different ones. He almost smiled. Almost. I said, can I ask you something? He nodded. I said, that picture you drew when you were 7, the one of our family with me and you and Garrett. You gave me very large hands. He looked surprised. I remember that. I said, did that mean something, or was I just hard to draw? He looked at me for a long moment. You were always doing things, he said finally. You were always fixing something or making something or cleaning something. I think I just drew you as someone who was always doing something, not controlling. Doing. I don't know if there's a meaningful difference in the end between a person who controls and a person who perpetually acts. Both of them fill all the available space. Both of them leave very little room, but he said it gently. It wasn't an accusation. It was just memory. I said, I'm going to start leaving the light off. He looked at me. When you're out, I said. You know where the switches are? He nodded. Slowly, I said goodnight. I went downstairs. I did not cry immediately. That surprised me. The crying came later, in the quiet of my room, with the quality of something being set down rather than something being lost. An old carrying finally rested. It has been 18 months since that conversation. Theo is 19 now. He's at college, about 2 hours from Summerfield, which is close enough for him and far enough for him, and I've made my peace with both of those things. He calls me on Sunday evenings. Not every Sunday, some Sundays he has things and he texts instead, and I have trained myself with meaningful effort to receive a text with the same warmth as a call. We talk. Really talk. The way we used to when he'd wander into whatever room I was in after school, except now the wandering is his choice in a way I understand it wasn't before. He chooses to call. That is different from the light being on. That is different from a tray in front of a door. I have things that are mine now. I started painting again. Something I'd done in my 20s and dropped when Theo arrived, because there hadn't seemed to be room. I have a standing Thursday night dinner with Nola and 2 other friends. I'm taking an Italian class on Tuesday mornings that I am catastrophically bad at and completely enjoy. I'm not telling you these things as evidence that I solved myself. I'm telling you because Theo asked me once, about 6 months ago, what I had been up to that week, and I had actual things to say. Several things that had nothing to do with him. And the quality of his silence on the other end of the phone was something I can only describe as relief. He told me recently that he talks to a therapist at his university, different from the one he'd seen at 17, but he said the work he did then helped him more than he'd been able to say at the time. He said he's still figuring out who he is, and that Summerfield feels both close and very far. He said, and this is the part I am most proud of and also most humbled by, he said that the hardest part of his teenage years wasn't that I had suffocated him. It was that he loved me so much and felt so guilty for needing space from someone he loved, that the guilt almost made him angrier than the original thing. He said, I didn't want to hurt you. That's what made it hard. I have thought about that for days. The drawing is off the refrigerator. It's in a frame in my bedroom next to my dresser. I look at it sometimes. Me with very large hands, always doing something. The image doesn't hurt the way it used to. It feels like a portrait of someone I was, made by someone who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. I used to think that the depth of my love for my son was, by itself, enough. That if I could simply continue to demonstrate the fullness of what I felt, keep the light on, cook the dinner, remain available, remain present, remain tirelessly, devotedly there, love would be enough to build something whole on. Now I know that love without self-possession is its own kind of weight. That the most loving thing I could do for Theo wasn't to need him less, it was to be more complete without him. To have a life full enough that his absence didn't register as emergency. To be someone, not just someone's mother. I wasn't holding on because I was afraid of losing him. I was holding on because I didn't know who I was without something to hold. That's what I've been sitting with. And I don't have a tidy place to put it, which is maybe why I'm here, saying it out loud. I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely, because I still think about it and I still don't have a settled answer. Is there a difference between loving someone and needing them? Or are those always the same thing? Tell me what you think. I'd genuinely like to know.